At number 5 is Ju-on the Grudge. Quick disclaimer, I'm not Japanese, so don't expect any perfect pronunciation. Feel free to correct me in the comments though. Ju-on the Grudge, released in 2002 and directed by Takashi Shimizu, is a movie part of the Ju-on movie franchise, which explores the terrifying consequences of a vengeful curse. Known for its chilling atmosphere and fragmented storytelling approach, the film has left an indelible mark on the horror genre. The narrative of The Grudge is split up into pieces, presenting a non-linear sequence of events that revolve around a cursed house in Tokyo. While some find this form of storytelling to be a little confusing, I like it because it keeps you engaged, you know? Anyway, the film delves into the horrifying tale of Kayako Seiki, a woman who becomes a malevolent spirit after being killed by her husband Takeo, along with their son Toshio, in a gruesome event that ended in him taking his own life. He killed his family after he came to believe that Kayako was having an affair. Jealous much? And so the spirits of all three are bound to their family home as manifestations of just pure hatred and rage, hence the name The Grudge. The movie is characterized by its eerie and unsettling ambiance, often relying on subtle scares and psychological horror rather than relying on excessive gore or jump scares. The use of unconventional narrative techniques, like overlapping timelines and interconnected character arcs, contributes to the film's disorienting and disturbing atmosphere. The origins of Kayako's story can be traced back to an old Japanese myth known as Onryo. Onryo roughly translates to vengeful spirit, and refers to a ghost that inhabits the living realm in order to seek revenge for their mistreatment they experienced in their past life. There are many tales of Onryo that exist within Japan, but the one which stands as inspiration for The Grudge is Oiwa. Oiwa was a young woman, deeply in love with her husband, Tamiya Lemon, despite the fact that he was cheating on her. But when Oiwa's father discovered his infidelity, Lemon killed him and later killed a pregnant Oiwa too. During his marriage ceremony to his new bride, Lemon lifted her veil only to see Oiwa's disfigured and rotting face. In shock, Lemon beheaded his new bride, setting off a series of supernatural events. Oiwa's vengeful spirit began to haunt Lemon relentlessly, driving him to madness and causing his eventual death. The Grudge went on to be a major success, spawning several sequels, franchise installments, a trilogy of American remakes, a Netflix series, and in 2020 they made another American Grudge movie. So if you couldn't tell, The Grudge is a certified classic. Next up at number 4, Gozu. Released in 2003 and directed by Takashi Miike, Gozu is a surreal and mind-bending Japanese horror comedy crime film extravaganza that delves into the realms of the bizarre and the grotesque. Known for his provocative and unconventional filmmaking, Miike crafts an unsettling narrative that blurs the lines between reality and the supernatural, leaving audiences both perplexed and intrigued. Gozu follows Minami, a Yakuza enforcer, as he embarks on a strange and nightmarish journey to hunt down his missing colleague, Ozaki. The film's narrative takes increasingly bizarre turns as Minami encounters a series of eccentric characters and surreal situations in a seemingly mundane town. As Minami's search for Ozaki intensifies, the film's surrealism deepens, leading to a climax that defies traditional narrative conventions. At the heart of Gozu lies a real urban legend that serves as a central motif in the film: the cow-headed man. The legend of the cowhead is a macabre and unsettling tale that plays a significant role in the movie's strange atmosphere. According to the legend, a cow's head appears mysteriously and malevolently in the dreams of those who have angered it, and it is said to possess and drive people insane with fear until their deaths. One story tells of a school teacher who, while on a camping trip with students, decided to tell the legend of the Gozu to his students as a fun, scary story. But when he began the story, his eyes went glossy, his face expressionless, and he told the story as if some mystical force had taken over all his senses. When the teacher came back to his senses, he found himself sitting in the bus they took to the camp, crashed into a ditch. All of the students inside had fainted and were frothing from their mouths, sweating and shivering. While everyone survived the crash, the events that took place make for a chilling mystery about a man possessed by Gozu, the cow-headed man. The film's use of the cowhead legend adds layers of complexity to its narrative, infusing it with cultural symbolism and unsettling imagery. As a result, Gozu stands as a testament to Takashi Miike's unique and daring approach to filmmaking. It makes for a pretty crazy horror movie too.
In third place, we have a ducking chair, not to be confused with a cucking chair, which is a whole other concept, or the red hot stools woman accused of having sexual acts with the devil would have to sit on. I sadly don't have enough information to unpack that stool, other than ouch. But let's get on with the ducking, shall we? The ducking stool was a strongly made wooden armchair, often made out of oak, in which the offender was seated, with an iron band being placed around them so that they would not fall out during their immersion. How thorough. The earliest record of the use of such is towards the beginning of the 17th century, with the term first being attested in English in 1597. It was used both in Europe and in the English colonies of North America. Usually the chair was fastened to a long wooden beam fixed as like a seesaw on the edge of a pond or river. And as much as I love and miss wooden playgrounds, I feel like this might not have been as fun. Sometimes the ducking stool was not a fixture, but was mounted on a pair of wooden wheels so that it could be wheeled through the streets, and at the river edge was hung by a chain from the end of a beam. In sentencing a woman, the magistrates ordered the number of duckings she should have, and as much as I've scoured the internet, I can't seem to find number data on this. If you have any ideas, please let me know in the comments. Another type of ducking stool was called a tumbrel, and was a chair on two wheels with two long shafts fixed to the axles. This was pushed into the pond, and then the shafts would be released, ergo tipping the chair up backwards. Sometimes the punishment proved fatal and the subject died. Once again, the sometimes should be taken with a pound of salt. In medieval times until the early 18th century, ducking was a way used to establish whether a suspect was a witch. The ducking stools were first used for this purpose, but ducking was later inflicted without the chair. In this instance, the subject's right thumb was bound to her left big toe, her left thumb to her right big toe, a rope was tied around the waist of the accused, and she was thrown into a river or a deep pond. If she floated, it was deemed that she was in league with the devil, rejecting the baptismal water. If she sank, she was cleared. Oh, and she'd be dead. Can't forget that part. Silly me. In second place, we have witch mark hunting and pricking. Witch hunters often had their suspects stripped and publicly examined for signs of an unsightly blemish that witches were said to receive upon making their pact with Satan. This devil's mark could supposedly change shape and color and was believed to be numb and insensitive to pain. Prosecutors might also search for the witch's teat, which was an extra nipple allegedly used to suckle the witch's helper animals. In both cases, it was really easy for even the most minor physical imperfections to be labeled as the work of the devil himself. Oh my, the horror. Moles, scars, birthmarks, sores, and tattoos could all qualify, so examiners rarely came up empty-handed. I'm trying to think of just how many birthmarks I have all over my body, so just add that to the tally of how I'm, a witch. Seriously, I feel the burning from the flames already. In the midst of witch hunts, desperate villagers would sometimes even burn or cut off any offending marks on their bodies, only to have their wounds labeled as proof of a covenant with the devil. So, damned if you do, damned if you don't. If I'm adding scars to my blemish count, yeah, forget it. Okay, I think the temperature in here just went up another couple of degrees. Seriously. If witch hunters struggled to find obvious evidence of witches' marks on a suspect's body, they might resort to the ghastly practice of pricking as a means of, sussing it out. Come on! Even having a flawless body isn't going to exonerate you? What the heck? Witch hunting books and instructional pamphlets noted that the marks were insensitive to pain and couldn't bleed, so examiners used specially designed needles to repeatedly stab and prick at the accused person's flesh until they discovered a spot that produced the desired results. In England and Scotland, the punishment was eventually performed by well-paid professional prickers, many of whom were actually con men who used dull needle points to identify fake witches' marks. Well then, if you ever feel like your job just, isn't real, remember that people in history were paid to do well. Along with pricking, the unfortunate suspect might also be subjected to scratching by their supposed victims. This test was based on the notion that possessed people found relief by scratching the person responsible with their fingernails until they drew fluid. If their symptoms improved after clawing at the accused's skin, it was seen as partial evidence of guilt. No, absolutely not. I can't see anyone being proven innocent whatsoever from this nonsense. Talk about a biased court. In first place, we have dismemberment and mutilation. This is where my own stomach gets all topsy-turvy, so fair warning, I can handle creepy stuff, no problem. But gore? There is a reason I haven't been able to bring myself to watch the Terrifier movies. So when witch hunters wanted to get answers back in the day, if I haven't made it clear enough by now, they didn't really care about being humane or, coercion, just being right. They would do whatever they deemed necessary to get a confession, leading many witches to confess just to make the pain stop and end their lives, humanely. Say goodbye to your fingernails, because that was practically just a footnote in what they were allowed to do. Walpurga Hosmanen of Bavaria was led through multiple different stages of mutilation while being paraded to her execution. At the first stop, her left breast and right arm were branded with irons, then her right breast at the second stop, her left arm at the third, with her left hand being then branded at the fourth stop. Once they reached the place of execution, her right hand, with which she had made her oath as a midwife, was cut off before she was finally burned alive at the stake. Oh, her ashes were not allowed to remain on soil. but they were just, dumped in a stream. Probably the most extreme extent of this was a punishment normally reserved for killers, but exceptions were made for witches who confessed without torture to crimes deemed brutal enough for it. Are y'all ready for this? The offender would be strapped to 4 horses, with one arm or leg attached to each separate horse, and then on command, the horses would start running and rip the offender's arms and legs off. The person would die somehow, and painfully through life source and limb loss. And on that note, we've reached the end of our time. In 5th place, we have Knockton Hall Hospital. So it was built in 1530 and originally meant for residential use, but served as a hospital for American officers who were injured in World War I. It was used once more as a military hospital during World War II and has been used in a similar capacity ever since, but no more. In the 1980s, it was once again put to private use, but by the 1990s, a significant fire had rendered it uninhabitable. Time for the dark stuff. It's alleged that one of the male owners of the home sexually took advantage of and killed a young girl. Today, her presence has been reported by various people who were in the building. Many people claim to have seen the ghostly image appearing at exactly 4:30 a.m., since she's fond of standing at the end of staff members' beds in the middle of the night. Interesting that she chooses the 4 a.m. hour to appear, since 3 a.m. is usually the preferred time for spirits, since that's when the veil between our world and theirs is the thinnest. So this spirit has been blamed for the disembodied sound of sobbing around the building. The building is also said to have a resident gray lady, but information around her is a lot harder to find, so let me know in the comments if, there's any experts out there, because any ghostie with a missing story is super intriguing to me. In 4th place, we have the Trenton State Hospital, originally known as the New Jersey State Lunatic Asylum, later Trenton State, and now Trenton Psychiatric Hospital. It was the very first one founded on the Kirkbride Plan by activist Dorothea Dix, but it's more remembered for, its medical no-nos instead of its well-intentioned beginnings. Dr. Henry Cotton became the director of the hospital in 1907 and instituted treatments based on his own theories of mental illness. On the one hand, Henry, who had trained at Johns Hopkins under the eminent Swiss-born psychiatrist Adolf Meyer, had a very progressive attitude towards care for his patients. He did away with the mechanical restraints that so many other hospitals use to control patients, introduced occupational therapy, increased the staff, and ensured that the nurses would prevent violence against the patients, and instituted daily staff meetings about patient care. But Henry developed a dangerous theory about mental illness, one that turned his hospital into a house of horrors. After it was confirmed in 1913 that the spirocate that caused syphilis can cause the disease's psychiatric symptoms, Henry began to suspect that all mental illness was caused by bodily infections, and that the only way to cure the patient was to remove the offending infection. In 1917, he began removing his patients' teeth, even in cases where x-rays showed no evidence of infection. Ow! He soon moved on to the other body parts: gallbladder, stomachs, ovaries, testicles, tracts of colon, uteruses. Henry claimed a cure rate of 85%, but in reality his surgeries had an unconsciously high mortality rate, and he didn't always obtain consent from the patients or their family members, and in fact sometimes performed these removals despite their protests. And hey, if that isn't icky enough, he wasn't quiet at all about what he was doing. The crazy doctor published papers and gave presentations on his work. When Mayer, Henry's mentor, sent another psychiatrist to report on the operations at Trenton State, he initially suppressed the report, allowing Henry to continue his gruesome work. He remained at Trenton until 1930, 3 years before his death. Now, the tooth-pulling practice remained in place until 1960, and my mouth hurts thinking about it. Before I get nightmares, time to move on to the fun stuff. As for the ghosts themselves, they are thought to all be those of patients that died within the building, but the most well-known ghost is that of Dr. Henry himself, who has been seen wearing a white doctor's coat and walking down the corridor in the area outside his office. The most commonly reported phenomenon at the hospital is that of disembodied voices, mainly muffled screams and moans coming from distant rooms. Orbs can be caught throughout the building at any time of the day, with some having a strong pale blue glow to them. There are also tales of seeing the ghosts of patients with arms and legs missing, who have been seen in some of the rooms upon, somebody entering them, only to fade away after a few seconds. See, the ghosts of patients I'd love to see, but I feel like seeing Henry would terrify me for a while now that I know, what he did in his lifetime. A lovely example of why to not enable people who do bad things.
Number 3 on this list is the South Pole Expedition. Sir Ernest Shackleton was an Anglo-Irish Antarctic explorer who lived from 1874 to 1922. After hearing about his 1914 expedition to Antarctica though, it's actually a miracle that this guy made it all the way to 1922. The explorer had the goal of making it across Antarctica. They'd intended to take a ship, land on the continent, and then trek across it to the other side. What they were going to do when they got to the other side is anyone's guess, but luckily they never even needed to worry about that part. No, the issues for them had happened far earlier. As they were sailing to Antarctica, they started slowing down and slowing down and slowing down until they finally stopped completely. They realized that the water around them had turned to ice and they were now frozen in place. Rather than get out and walk it, they decided to wait until the ice thawed and then they would keep going. They apparently sat on that ship waiting for this to happen for 10 months though. Then at the 10-month mark, the ice didn't break and their ship just actually sank. So now we have this group of explorers without much supplies stranded on the ice in the middle of an ocean. They were smart enough to save their lifeboat though and managed to take it and themselves to the nearest landmass. By this point, the expedition was completely ruined and now they just needed to focus on survival. They had to leave some men behind and Ernest and some other guys got in a lifeboat and decided to sail it over 800 miles in the ocean. It should also be noted that this was during World War I, so if they ran into the wrong ship, then it could have all been over for them anyways. They made it to land and then they realized that to get to people, they actually needed to climb an entire mountain range. And believe it or not, they actually did and finally made it to some civilization on South Georgia Island. This expedition didn't lose as many men as some other ones, but pretty much anything that could go wrong did go wrong. The fact that anyone survived is truly pretty miraculous. Number 2 on this list is Ferdinand Magellan's expedition to the Philippines. So you probably remember the name Ferdinand Magellan from history class growing up. If you don't though, he was a Portuguese explorer best known for his expedition to the East Indies across the Pacific Ocean. The actual expedition resulted in completely new trade routes opening up and the discovery of the interoceanic passage. This was definitely a success, but it wasn't quite as nice for Magellan or most of his crew to be honest. Out of the 260 people that left for this expedition in 1519, only 18 actually survived and made it back home 2 years later. The biggest problem that took most of the lives of these explorers was food supplies. Back then, no one had any idea how big the ocean actually was and how long it would take them to sail across it. Therefore, the food and water that they brought along with them was woefully insufficient in feeding 260 men for an extended period of time. Several months went by on the high seas and the supplies started to wear thin. With no sign of land in sight, the crew had to resort to drastic measures. It started with crumbs that were filled with maggots, then moved on to cooked leather that was on the boat, then went straight to sawdust, and then finally to any rats that they could find. This was just for food though. For drink, they had to have yellow water. I feel like I don't need to explain what that is, but I can promise you that it wasn't pretty. Many people died from disease and malnourishment on the boat before they finally reached the Philippines. Here, they were attacked by a bunch of natives and Magellan was stabbed in the face with a spear. So I suppose that you could argue that this expedition wasn't cursed since they actually did reach their destination, but 18 out of 260 is a pretty rough ratio of survivors, and drinking pee-pee water while eating boat leather, I mean, that doesn't sound too great either. Number 1 on this list is the Spanish expedition to the Gulf of Mexico. Back in the early 1500s, there was a craze in Europe for acquiring gold. This was especially true about the gold in the Americas, this magical new land of resources that had recently been discovered. Well, Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, and yeah, that's his actual real name, was a Spanish explorer who wanted to get in on the action. He decided to organize an expedition to America right around where Florida is, get his share of the gold, come back to Spain, and be a rich man. This didn't work out the best for him or countless men that he decided to bring along though. The Spanish explorer managed to round up about 600 other Spaniards to come along in this expedition for gold. They set off from Spain and actually managed to cross the Atlantic without too much of a hitch. When they got to what's now the Dominican Republic in a layover, they did lose roughly 100 of the men though. Now this wasn't too bad because they still had about 500 and the 100 men just decided that they were done with the mission and wanted to stay in the Dominican, but it was the beginning of the bad luck for the remaining crew. After leaving this layover, they immediately got hit with a massive hurricane which killed tons of men and lots of their horses. Then, when the remainder of the crew arrived in Florida, not only were lots of their supplies already lost, but they had to fight off countless waves of native attacks. They were losing miserably and had to get out, so apparently they broke down their weapons and supplies and tried to make some makeshift boats to get away from where they were. This actually worked for a little bit, right up until they got hit with another hurricane and fell into the sea. At that point, the roughly 80 men that survived this had to get to shore, but very quickly when they did, got enslaved by the native people that had been attacking them in the first place. 10 years later, 4 men managed to cross into a Spanish colony in Mexico, claiming that they were the only 4 men left from the initial expedition that set out a decade ago. 4 men out of 600. I have no idea what cursed this expedition, but this thing, it was doomed the second they left Spain. Number 5 on this list is the expeditions of Ernest Giles. Ernest Giles really only has himself to blame when it comes to his expeditions because he went on 4 separate ones. You'd think that he would have learned his lesson after the first one, but I guess not. Ernest Giles lived from 1835 to 1897 and was an explorer of Australia. Not much was known about Australia at this point other than the fact that it was pretty big. Ernest Giles wanted to shed some light on the country and made it his mission to explore the continent. His first expedition was in 1872 and was decently successful. Him and 2 other men wandered around the continent and discovered some interesting landmarks on the way. The second one wasn't nearly as well thought out though. Ernest set out on an expedition with 1 other man named Alfred Gibson. Apparently Alfred Gibson knew absolutely nothing about exploring in the desert though, so this was a pretty silly move to have this guy be your one partner. At the 8-month mark, the 2 were deep into the Australian wilderness when one of the horses died of thirst. This was pretty problematic and meant that one guy was either walking or getting left behind. Well, for Ernest, it was a little bit of both. Somehow they came to the conclusion that Alfred Gibson would take the horse and ride on ahead and Ernest would travel the rest on foot. The insane part about this though is that Ernest actually survived and Gibson didn't. Gibson was never heard or seen again and presumably perished in the desert. Whereas Ernest, after an 8-day walk with no food, carrying a massive cask of water on his back and hallucinating the entire way, managed to survive. The one piece of food that he had in the 8-day journey was a baby walleye, and he wrote in his journal that he pounced upon it, ate it, living, raw, dying, fur, skin, bones, skull, and all. Guys, I'm totally cool with going on the occasional hike, but that whole thing, that's a bit extreme for me. Number 4 on this list is David Livingston's expedition. David Livingston lived from 1813 to 1873 and was a Scottish physician and also an explorer of Africa. He was notably most fascinated with the Nile River and where it came from. That's why in 1866 he decided to set out with a group of local guides on foot to discover where this river actually originated from. Clearly Livingston didn't conduct the hiring process well enough though, because these guides, they weren't to be trusted. They led him for a time, but soon started to become bored of this expedition and realized that they had all the power in this relationship. They abandoned him, with some of them even stealing a few of his supplies. When they got back to society and were asked about his whereabouts, they told everyone inquiring that he had just died in the jungle. This was a pretty bad situation for Livingston to find himself in, but it actually gets a lot worse. He trekked through the jungle by himself for a time, but eventually had completely run out of supplies and had to get assistance from someone. Lucky for him, there were some passing slave traders that used this route often. Unluckily for him though, they brought him to the village of Bambara. Clearly the villagers here were not accustomed to seeing a white person and were pretty shocked by this. They responded by taking Livingston and putting him into a zoo. That's right guys, David Livingston was put into a roped off cage so that he could be an attraction for those passing through the village. Finally, someone who knew Livingston heard of this man that was caged up and came to his rescue. When he got there though, Livingston wasn't in the best shape. Extremely malnourished, crippled, and currently dying of malaria, he'd definitely seen some better days. He was saved from the cage, but didn't last too much longer after that, eventually dying from disease. This story just goes to show you that if you're gonna get a guide, make sure it's somebody that you can trust.
Coming in at number 3, Teke Teke. The story goes that Teke Teke is the vengeful spirit of a young woman who was tragically sliced in half by a train while trying to escape from a creepy assailant. Her gruesome demise gave rise to her admittedly funny name, derived from the sound she makes when she crawls over to you on her fingers. Teke Teke. Teke 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 Teke. Can't tell if that's creepy or silly yet, to be honest with you guys. But the spirit of Teke Teke is said to haunt lonely and dimly lit places, moving with incredible speed on her hands, emitting that Teke Teke sound as she approaches her victims. Those unfortunate enough to encounter her face a grim fate, as she mercilessly slices them in half with a scythe, mirroring her own tragic demise. The horror movie of the same name was made in 2009 and capitalizes on the fear associated with the ghost. It follows a group of high school students who become entangled in the horrifying mystery surrounding Teke Teke after they witness a gruesome killing. As the students dig deeper into the legend, they find themselves pursued by the malevolent spirit, leading to a series of gruesome and terrifying encounters. So, if you guys are ever alone in Japan and hear that haunting teke teke noise, run as fast as you can. Because even though she's lacking in the leg department, teke teke moves really fast. Teke. Anyway, at number 2 is The Ring. By far the most iconic movie on this list, Ring, released in 1998 and directed by Hideo Nakata, follows investigative journalist Reiko Asakawa as she attempts to uncover the truth behind a cursed videotape that leads to the death of anyone who watches it 7 days later. The movie masterfully blends psychological horror and supernatural elements, creating an atmosphere of suspense and terror that has inspired just about every movie on this list. The movie's success lies in its ability to evoke primal fears, particularly the fear of technology and the unknown. In a rapidly modernizing world, the concept of a malevolent force being transmitted through a video taps into contemporary anxieties surrounding technology that are still prevalent today, 25 years after the movie's release. The story is based on a deadly ghost by the name of Okiku. Okiku was a servant whose primary duty was to look after 10 highly valuable golden plates owned by the samurai that she worked for. One day, the samurai, madly in love, but very misguided, hid one of the plates and told Okiku that if she didn't agree to be with him, he would blame her for stealing the plate, which would lead to her execution. Okiku, cornered, decided to jump down a well, ending her life. From then on, her ghost would crawl out the well and appear to the samurai on a nightly basis, tormenting him. She was regularly heard counting those golden plates in the dungeon, going into a fit of rage and violence whenever she realized that 10th plate was missing, which it always was. The imagery of crawling and the idea of this rage coming out when the ghost finishes counting inspired filmmakers to create the character of Sako, the ghost in the movie, and is what helped make this movie the horror staple that it is. Ring's profound impact on the horror genre in both Japan and globally helped spawn sequels, prequels, remakes, and a cultural phenomenon known as the Curse of Sadako, named after the film's vengeful spirit. Topping it off at number 1 is Hanako of the Toilet, and yes, that is the actual name of the movie. Hanako of the Toilet, released in 1995, is a Japanese horror film that delves into the eerie and unsettling urban myth surrounding the titular ghostly figure. Rooted in Japanese folklore and contemporary true urban legends, Hanako of the Toilet captures the fascination with supernatural entities that occupy everyday spaces, striking a chord with audiences' primal fears and morbid curiosity. The urban myth of Hanako is a popular and enduring legend in Japanese culture. The story typically centers around a young girl named Hanako who is said to haunt school restrooms, particularly the third stall of the third floor girls' bathroom. Yes, I know, very specific. Hanako is often portrayed as a ghostly figure dressed in a red skirt, lurking in the restroom and waiting to interact with those who dare to call her name. Different versions of the myth exist, with variations on how Hanako met her demise and the nature of her interaction with those who seek her out. Hanako of the Toilet brings this urban legend to life on the silver screen, capitalizing on the fear of the unknown and the uncanny. The film follows a group of students who decide to investigate the legend of Hanako, leading to a series of chilling and supernatural encounters. The movie's setting in the school, a place associated with safety and innocence, serves to intensify the sense of horror as the young students confront the ghostly presence that dwells within the restroom. While Hanako of the Toilet brings the legend to life cinematically, it also adds its own spin to the story. The film expands upon the story, delving into the backstory of Hanako and her connection to a tragic event. This narrative depth adds layers to the horror, providing audiences with a more intricate understanding of the ghostly figure and the circumstances that led to her haunting presence. And because I can, here's a bonus movie: Sadako vs. Kayako. Released in 2016, Sadako vs. Kayako is actually a crossover movie between The Grudge and The Ring. The plot is essentially that there's these two women, both cursed by these two different ghosts, and instead of just sitting there and dying, they come up with this scheme to get the spirits in a room together and make them fight. The film garnered mixed reviews and not much success, as it doesn't really combine the two stories very well together. It all felt like a jumbled mess. However, it's still a pretty fun watch if you don't want to take it seriously, because it's just two iconic Japanese ghost girls duking it out. What better way to spend your Friday night, right guys?
Number 5, the Manson Family. Starting out with the most famous of the cults on this list, we have the group of young people who fell under the spell of Charles Manson in the late 1960s in California, USA. Charles Manson was in and out of prison for most of his life before settling in San Francisco and beginning to establish himself as a guru during the height of the summer summer of love hippie culture. Using some elements from the philosophy of the Process Church of Final Judgment, who believed that at the end of the world, Jesus and Satan would join forces to judge humanity, Manson formed a group of mostly young women, teaching them that they were reincarnations of the original Christians, and that he was Jesus Christ. In a converted school bus, the group made their way to Los Angeles, where Manson preached and continued to grow his group of followers. They stayed in the home of Dennis Wilson, of the Beach Boys, for a time, before eventually moving them to an old disused western movie set, Spawn Ranch. In exchange for the company of the many female followers, the owner of the ranch, George Spawn, allowed Manson and his growing family to stay at the ranch free of charge. Manson began using his followers for extortion, taking a music teacher who they believed had inherited a large fortune hostage in his home and demanding that he join the cult and turn over the money. The man maintained that they were mistaken, and Manson attacked him with a sword before having one of his followers finish the job. In the cult's most famous incident, Manson sent 4 family members to the home of Hollywood actress Sharon Tate, with instructions for them to end the lives of Tate and her 4 guests, who were staying with her. The next night, these family members were joined by 3 others, and brought by Manson to the home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, where they broke in and tied up the 2 residents at Manson's instructions. He then ordered them to dispatch the victims and left. Although it hasn't been conclusively proven, the Manson family are believed to be responsible for at least 15 other people, with Manson himself claiming at one point that he was responsible for 35 total deaths. Manson was apprehended and put on trial along with the family members who had carried out his orders, but the trial showed just what a hold Manson still had over his family. Family members showed up outside the courthouse where they held a vigil while armed with hunting knives. They threatened witnesses, setting fire to one man's van while he was still inside it. The trial itself was also a wild time, with one of the defense attorneys who Manson disagreed with going missing and being discovered murdered, and Manson at one point leaping over a table to try and attack the judge while the other defendants began chanting in Latin. Manson and the murderous family members were sent to prison in 1971. Manson remained in prison until his death in 2017. Number 4. Om Shinrikyo. This Japanese doomsday cult started out as a simple yoga and meditation class, which was founded by Shoko Asahara, using his bizarre interpretations of various forms of Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, yoga, and the works of Nostradamus. In 1992, Shoko published a book that claimed that he was not only Christ, but Japan's only enlightened master. He claimed that he had the ability to take away the sins and bad deeds of his followers and transfer spiritual power to them. As is the case in a lot of cults, he claimed that doomsday was fast approaching and that everyone except his followers would be killed. The movement grew, eventually getting enough members to be considered an official religion. Membership continued to grow, but rumblings began emerging that some members were being tricked into joining, were being forced to donate large sums of money, being held against their will, and in one case even murdered when they tried to leave. An anti-cult lawyer tried to sue the group and soon went missing with his wife and child. Things escalated even further in 1993 when the group tried to use a machine to pump anthrax onto a neighborhood in Tokyo. Although thankfully, the group had stolen the wrong type of anthrax and no one was hurt. Due to the failure of the anthrax, the group began manufacturing sarin and VX nerve gas, which they used in their subsequent attacks. In 1994, the group used a converted refrigerator truck to release the gas on a neighborhood where judges, who were presiding over a lawsuit against the group, lived. 500 people were injured and 8 died, but the attack was not linked to the cult at the time. A few months later, the brother of a member who had escaped was kidnapped, dispatched by the group, and disposed of with a microwave-powered incinerator. He had left a note saying that should he go missing, the group was responsible. Asahara was trying to manufacture weapons, and in order to distract the police, had some of his followers carry out a devastating attack. On March 20th, 1995, OM members boarded 5 separate trains in Tokyo's subway system and released sarin gas, resulting in 13 people dying, 54 being seriously injured, and between 980 and 6,000 people being hurt. This distraction backfired, and the police raided the group's base at the foot of Mount Fuji and discovered explosives, weapons, biological warfare agents, and even a Russian military helicopter. Over 150 cult members were arrested. The next month, a burning paper bag containing a hydrogen cyanide device was found and defused. Had it not been found in time, over 10,000 people could have died. Several other similar devices were found in the days following, and more disasters were averted. Asahara was eventually eventually arrested as his cult continued to attack people connected with the investigation, sending bombs in the mail to the governor, resulting in his secretary's fingers being blown off. In October of 1995, the group was stripped of its religious status and went bankrupt, but it managed to rebrand and still operates in a limited capacity to this day. Asahara and the 12 other cult members who had been found responsible for the attacks were arrested and held until their executions in 2018.
In third place, we have the London Asylum for the Insane. So in 1870, London introduced its first asylum, and as one of the first institutions to treat mental illness in Ontario, Canada, it was, revolutionary. Hey, within days, their 500 beds were full. So it was located just outside of the city center, and the asylum initially focused on compassionate care and moral therapy. Their intent was to treat the patient as a whole being, rather than, focusing on a single symptom. Patients would be bettered as members of society, fitting in with the community by keeping steady jobs and following strict social norms, thus, curing their mental illnesses. Now, while conforming to the ideals of conservative society sounds horrid to me, I do understand that at the time it was probably a safe move. The world is a lot more forgiving now of individuality and understanding of differences, even though we still have a long way to go. So doctors at the asylum also performed several experimental surgeries. In fact, Dr. Richard Maurice Buck, who believed, failed reproductive organs to be the source of mental illness or hysteria in women, executed routine hysterectomies. Moving into the 1930s, shock therapy was introduced to treat symptoms of schizophrenia by inducing seizures. Lobotomies were also completed between 1944 and 1967. While we don't know how many were performed in, London specifically, there are about 1,000 between these 23 years across Ontario. One reason that someone would be sent to the asylum includes sexual deviation. What is, shockingly expectant is that body self-love was identified as the root cause of a majority of mental illnesses. So Dr. Buck thought he had remedied this self-harm by inserting a metal wire into the foreskin of a man's penis so that the act would be too painful and uncomfortable. So what this doctor did not know is, that self-love is actually a positive action for sexual health and is not the cause of mental illness, as he would later discover after 11 failed attempts of reversing what he did. What am I forgetting? Feel like there's something I haven't mentioned yet. Oh, right! Ghosts. There was a tree at the main door which was dead and black in color, while vegetation was growing all around it, and that was the tree that patients ended their lives from. The chapel is known to be haunted, with the temperature inside always feeling ice cold, even though it might be sweltering hot outdoors, and the recreation building has also been known to be the home of many unknown ghosts. But the one ghost you want to avoid is that of the bad doctor himself, who passed away on the grounds in February of 1902 when he paused to gaze at the stars one winter's night and lost his balance and, died from the resulting head injury. It's alleged that he was pushed by the ghost of one of his patients who had died from his morbid experimentation, but sadly the mortality rate, like I mentioned before, was so high that we don't know which patient it was. In second place, we have the Topeka State Hospital. So according to the Topeka Capital Journal, a reporter visited the facility at some point during the early 20th century and saw a patient who had been strapped down for so long that his skin had begun to grow over his restraints. So according to my research, this would take many months, if not years, to do so I am shuddering. Other patients were chained up, well naked, for months at a time. For many residents at that time, however, life offered a different similar sort of hell, even if they were unrestrained and unending boredom. Patients were given nothing to do, nothing to stimulate their minds, so they sat in rocking chairs in the hallway all day, rocking and staring and doing nothing else. Thankfully, in 1948, Kansas Governor Frank Carlson, responding to reports of overcrowding and deplorable conditions, convened a panel to, study the problem. The state legislature ended up doubling the appropriations for mental hospitals, and the rocking chairs were removed from the hallway. However, the hospital lost its Medicare and Medicaid accreditation in 1988, and like so many hospitals, lost patients to community-based programs during the 1990s. In 1997, the year I was born, the hospital closed its doors for good. The ghosts that wander what's left of the hospital are those of former patients, which I know, I'm sounding like a broken record. Oh, there's a cemetery on the hospital grounds, which is, the final resting place of patients who died in the hospital. Only 16 of the 1,157 graves have headstones, and most of the souls are left nameless. Visitors to the hospital grounds report seeing orbs and hearing strange moans coming from the cemetery. Yeah, no thank you. In first place, we have Century Manor. So built in 1884 on the outskirts of Hamilton, Ontario, Century Manor was the second major structural component of the Hamilton Asylum for the Insane, an institution initially established for the treatment of alcoholics. Newspaper articles published in the late 19th and early 20th centuries documented at least 9 self-deaths committed in the building, as well as several attempts made by inmates who escaped the hospital. Century Manor was also the scene of several strange accidents and horrific horrific crimes. One female patient fell to her death while attempting to, escape out a window using a rope made from bed sheets, while another had her skull crushed by a falling elevator. One particularly troublesome male inmate was allegedly slugged to death by orderlies, while another split open the head of the asylum's head baker with an axe. No biggie, right? Apparently the living conditions were so bad that in 1910, a former inmate wrote a letter to the Legislative Assembly of Ontario, stating that the place was an outrage to civilization. Allow me to read what he said. Wretched, vile torment is the order of the institutions. He had seen patients pounded, choked insensible time and time again until redness would run from their nostrils. Oh, I haven't even gotten to the most dramatic tale yet. In the early morning hours of August 11th on 1911, a fire mysteriously broke out on the building's top floor. Firefighters who battled the blaze said that 3 of the inmates they rescued from the burning building broke away from them and leapt back into the inferno. When the embers finally cooled, firefighters found 8 bodies amongst the ashes, including a paralytic who had burned to death in his cell, as well as 5 men huddled together in a small room, burnt to a crisp. Now, the historic building shut its doors for good in 1995 and has sat empty ever since, serving as a haunting reminder of Hamilton's dark and tragic history. And now that we've got the history out of the way, time to talk about the ghosties. My favorite part. Underneath the property of Century Manor lies a system of old tunnels. This first-hand account comes from Jeff Cooper, who was hired to guard the entire West 5th property overnight, and on one particular evening, he was making his rounds and ended up underground and inside the tunnels. He made a turn at one of the corners and found himself lost in a hallway with just one wooden door at the end. He heard voices coming from the other side of the door, so he walked up to it, quickly braced himself, took a few deep breaths, and swung the door open. There, sitting at a table in the middle of a small, dirty old room, were 2 women, dressed in old-fashioned nurses' uniforms. They both slowly turned and stared at him directly in the eye, until one of them spoke up and calmly said to the other, "See? I told you he'd find us." The security guard was so frightened that he backed out of the room, slammed the door behind him, and caught his breath. He gathered his nerves a second time and slowly opened the door to a completely empty room. The nurses had disappeared from the room, with no other exits being apparent or visible. The ghosts of the men who lost their lives in the fire are also known to roam what's left of the establishment, so if any urban explorers smell smoke while they're there, don't say I didn't warn ya.
Number 5 on this list is the Catholic persecution in Britain. This happened in the 16th and 17th century and was really not a good time to be alive if you were Catholic. The list first says, Britain has been trying to rebrand its historical image with tea and monocles, though it's hard to do given how violent its history has been. We're not even talking about the colonies here. A civilian in Old Britain may die in a variety of ways depending on the time period. The worst, however, would have probably been during the Catholic Rebellion and their eventual persecution. It was generally a time of upheaval in Europe, largely over the question of which kind of Christianity is the best one. The situation was especially bad in England as the ruling Protestants really did not like the Catholic population. If you were suspected of being a Catholic or harboring one, there were a number of creatively horrifying ways you could die. One woman was slowly and publicly crushed to death simply for refusing to talk when she was questioned for supporting the Catholics. You could be drawn and quartered, hung, or just lynched by a mob. The mob thing was rare as the central authorities made sure to intervene and kill you themselves before the situation got so out of hands. How nice of them. Yeah, so just a casual death by public crushing for maybe supporting Catholicism. This is a time in history that I feel doesn't get brought up nearly enough based on what happened. In all honesty, I didn't even really know about this time until I started doing some research for this video. Maybe that is because the British government has tried to do a full rebrand and doesn't really want to bring up the dark past of what was once one of the worst times to be alive. Throughout history, people have consistently been persecuted for their beliefs and how they want to live their lives. This was one of the worst examples of that in history, and it's definitely not a time that you would have wanted to be alive. Number 4 on this list is the Siege of Sarajevo. This time really isn't that far off from us at all, folks. This siege took place from 1992 to 1996. Sarajevo is the capital of Bosnia, and had you have lived in this place during that time, life would have been hell. List first says, sieges are an overall bad time to be in, and we highly recommend not being in one if it could be helped. Some of the most prolonged sieges in history history, like the Siege of Leningrad, have been huge humanitarian disasters too, as sieges primarily affect the citizens. One particularly horrifying siege that isn't mentioned that often is the Siege of Sarajevo by the Serbs, which is also the longest siege of a capital city in modern history. It went on for almost 4 years and close to 14,000 people ended up dying. If the incessant shelling on primarily civilian areas like the market didn't get you, you could die in many other ways. People were dying just from the harsh cold as there were no fuel supplies in many parts of the city. Quite a few of them had to move into shared spaces with other families without any amenities, turning an otherwise functioning city into a giant refugee camp. Many people were killed by snipers who deliberately targeted civilians. Think about being a citizen in that city during that time. Your entire life is literally just about surviving at that point. And not just for a week or for a month, for literally 4 years. 4 years of constant attack in horrible conditions to live in. 4 years of fearing that you and your family are gonna be killed. 4 years of freezing and having no good food to eat at all. And this literally happened not that long ago, guys. This just as easily could have been one of us that was caught living there. You were just in the wrong place in the wrong time, and now your life is uprooted and you need to fight to stay alive.
Number 3. Heaven's Gate. Not to be confused with the 1980 Western that flopped so hard that the director-driven film era in Hollywood was brought to an end. Heaven's Gate was an American religious movement founded in 1974 by Bonnie Nettles in Marshall Applewhittem, otherwise known as T and Doe. T met Doe while working at a hospital in 1972 when Doe was visiting a sick friend. Doe was really into biblical prophecy and upon meeting the woman felt that she was so familiar that they must have met in a past life. On the other hand, she claimed that aliens had told her that they would one day meet and that they had a divine mission to accomplish. You know, just like the Blues Brothers. The two studied religious and science fiction texts together, eventually coming to the logical conclusion that Doe was a reincarnated Jesus and that they had been chosen to fulfill the prophecies of the Bible and that they had been given higher level minds than most folks and were the two witnesses described in the book of Revelations. They were pretty sure that they would die and be resurrected, at which point a UFO would show up and take them away. They had trouble getting followers until they began advertising meetings where they claimed that aliens wanted volunteers for an experiment, which would result in the subjects being brought to a higher evolutionary level. They recruited over 100 members who they traveled the country with before becoming reclusive. Bonnie Nettles, aka T, died of liver cancer in 1985, and Marshall Applewhite, aka Doe, became the sole leader of the group. In 1996, the group rented a home in Rancho Santa Fe in California, which they referred to as the Monastery. In 1997, Doe made a video message claiming that they had to evacuate Earth by taking their own lives as Heaven's Gate was closing, and by dying, they would be taken by a UFO to a higher level of existence. Doe and 38 other cult members then dressed in identical black shirts with armbands that read Heaven's Gate Away Team, as an extremely macabre Star Trek reference. All of them were also wearing Nike Decades, as the group apparently had adopted the company's slogan of "Just Do It" as a personal slogan. The group then covered their heads with plastic bags and asphyxiated. They did this in 3 tiers so that the remaining members could take off their bags and arrange their bodies with dignity. In an interesting bit of trivia, in the aftermath of this incident, the Nike Decades have become a highly sought after collector's item due to their involvement in the incident, because of course they are. Number 2. The People's Temple Agricultural Project. Founded by Jim Jones in Indiana in 1955, the People's Temple preached that those who remained drugged with the opiate of religion had to be brought to enlightenment with socialism. Of course, this wasn't the fun Bernie Sanders socialism where everyone gets to go to college. Jordan's main influences were people like Chairman Mao and Joseph Stalin. He was driven out of Indiana due to having integrationist beliefs and went to California, where he became involved in local politics, helping George Moscone become mayor of San Francisco in 1975. As a result, Jones was made the chairman of the city's Housing Authority Commission, which allowed him to rub elbows with the wealthy and powerful. After some backlash from local newspapers and fears of a police crackdown, the group set up a commune in Guyana, which was a small and poor enough and independent enough country that Jones thought he would be able to easily get political influence and protection. With the approval of the local government, the group began building their commune, which they called Jonestown. He made a deal with the government that would allow hundreds of cult members to enter the country, but very difficult for them to leave. At its peak, Jonestown had about 900 people living in the small commune. Jones became more and more unhinged, controlling the media the group were allowed to consume, lest they be subjected to a movie that wasn't pro-Marxist. He made everyone in the commune work long shifts, 6 days a week. He continued to brainwash and manipulate his people, telling them that they would soon be under attack by the CIA and should prepare to eventually take their own lives as a form of revolutionary protest, and had them guard the entrances of Jonestown with machine guns and machetes. As concerns from family members in the states grew, investigations into Jonestown began. When a delegation of investigators, reporters, and concerned relatives went to visit the commune, they were able to convince a few members to defect. As they tried to return to the states on 2 planes, one of the defectors produced a handgun and began opening fire on the other passengers. At the same time, a tractor trailer stormed the airstrip, with the passengers of the trailer producing shotguns and firing at the planes, with none on board surviving. While this was happening, Jones had a cocktail of poisons mixed into a large tub of grape Flavor Aid, and had the 909 residents drink it and take their own lives. Despite the fact that it was Flavor Aid that was used by Jones, the incident was the source of the expression, "drink the Kool-Aid." Number 1. The Thuggy Cult. The Thuggy were a secret society operating in India in the mid-1800s who were known for attacking travelers and garroting them with a weapon called a rumal. Its members were trained from childhood in its use. They considered efficient and quiet acts of murder to be the greatest accomplishment possible. They would follow groups of travelers until they made camp, at which point they would attack. Word of the Thuggy began to grow as numerous bodies began to be discovered in wells around the countryside. However, the Thuggy were not attacking their victims simply to take their valuables. The number 1 rule of the cult was not to shed any of their victims' blood, as they were actually human sacrifices for their god, Kali. The Thuggy believed that constant indulgence in vices was the only way to become closer to and achieve union with their god. During the time that the cult was active, over 30,000 people were attacked by the Thuggy and sacrificed to Kali. British officers were tasked with eliminating the cult and began mapping out the cult's attacks in order to predict where the attacks would likely take place and set traps for the Thuggy while disguised as merchants and travelers. Between 1830 and 1841, at least 3,700 cult members were captured, effectively ending the group. Many were put in prison for the rest of their lives, with 500 of them being hanged. Without exception, all of them that went to the gallows showed no emotion or remorse, often requesting to put on their own nooses themselves. When asked if he was sorry, one member who claimed to have the Thuggy record for most victims at 931 responded that no one should ever feel bad for following their trade. The term thug is still used to this day to describe a brutal criminal, and the group is remembered for their various appearances as villains in films over the years, such as when they were depicted by Steven Spielberg in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom.
Number 5. Julie Brown. Our first witch today on the list of which witch is Julie Brown, legendary voodoo priestess of the swamps. New Orleans is filled to bursting with 2 things: the most wondrous advancements in soul food and gumbo technology on the planet, and ghost stories. There's a whole lot of voodoo to go around in Louisiana, and in Manchac they say there's the ghost of an old voodoo priestess named Julie Brown. The story of Julie Brown is an unnerving one. I would certainly hope so, otherwise it wouldn't be on this list. She was said to be reclusive, would sit on the porch of her swamp shack and spend the day cackling, predicting the demise of nearby towns and its residents, singing twisted songs about her death and the apocalypse and the end of days. Despite the fact that she was a kooky old lady singing songs about the apocalypse on her front steps, locals actually feared her and treated her as an oracle and a prophet, and were very nervous of wronging her just in case she placed a hex on them, which, you know, is reasonable. You should always treat everyone you meet with kindness, just in case they turn out to be a witch who can hex you. The prediction she's most known for, besides one bizarre correct prediction about the 1994 Super Bowl Cowboys at Bills game, was her threatening prediction in 1915, where Julie Brown would cackle over and over and over that she was going to die and take everyone with her. She chanted this again and again until her death. On her funeral, a hurricane hit the town, decimating 3 villages and taking countless lives. Julie is said to be buried in the swamp, and locals believe it was her spirit that caused the hurricane. And if you happen to be passing through Manchac, just pay your respects to Miss Julie Brown. Like I said, you never know what kind of secrets somebody has. And if you're looking for more stories about witches, or really any kind of urban legend, Top 5 Scary has all of that and then some. I'm not kidding. If you can think it up, there's pretty good odds we've done 2 to 3 videos on it. We got something scary for everything under the sun and above it. So hit subscribe. Please make sure you hit that little bell so you don't miss a single scream, but do that after this video because I got 4 more witch stories coming up for you right now. And wouldn't you know it, the next one's about a bell. Number 4, the Bell Witch. In the 1800s, a farmer going by the name of John Bell moved his family to picturesque Adams, Tennessee, onto a beautiful 300-acre farm, little slice of American pie. Bell quickly became a figurehead of the community, respected by many, and became a local leader at the town church. For the Bell family, things were the brightest they've ever been. They were living the dream and ringing in good fortune. I was trying to make a Bell pun work there. There's probably a better one. Things wouldn't be good for long, and they'd find themselves in a nightmare shortly. By 1817, strange, inexplicable things started to occur all around the farmstead. John Bell found a strange animal on the farmstead, a mutant hybrid that resembled a grotesque mix between a dog and a rabbit. I know that sounds like it would be cute, but I think if you get the wrong parts of both, that's just going to turn out to be a very, very ugly animal. I think dog, rabbit ears, pretty cute. Maybe like dog, rabbit face, dog, rabbit body. I don't know. Mess. Anyway, it was a disgusting thing. The younger members of the Bell family would wake up covered in red scratches all over their bodies at all hours of the day. The family would hear faint whispering and singing that sounded like an old woman singing hymns. Most tragic is the Bells found a mysterious vial of liquid inside their home that no one could explain or understand. Nervous about what it was, the Bells offered the mystery liquid to their cat, which passed almost immediately. Rest in peace, Bell cat, taken too soon, undeservedly. You didn't deserve to be an experiment for them. For 3 long years, the Bell family was tormented by a mysterious entity that would later become known as the Bell Witch, after the mysterious old woman's humming and singing. In 1820, John Bell quickly grew extremely ill, quickly descending in his health, and would pass away later. At his funeral, the mourners complained they could all hear the laughing of an old woman, mocking and singing the fate of the late John Bell. The farm became a haunted attraction, where it still is to this day, and it even caught the attention of President Andrew Jackson, who in 1819, a year before Mr. Bell's passing, visited to see if legends of the witch were real. Allegedly. As soon as his carriage arrived at the property, the horses refused to budge anymore. The animals can always tell.
Number 3 on this list is the Sengoku period. This was a period that took place in Japan from about 1467 to 1600. List verse says, the Sengoku period, lasting over 100 years, was one of the most defining parts of Japanese history, as well as one of the most influential. A lot of historical Japanese pop culture is set in that period, as it was a time of consistent war and rapidly shifting political climate. There were more warlords fighting for territory than you could count, as the central power of the shogun had weakened in recent times. For someone living in that period, war and suffering would have been part of your daily life. Apart from opposing factions regularly raiding villages and towns for supplies, civilians were often caught between battles they had nothing to do with. Of course, that wasn't the case in every village across Japan, as many of them thrived due to the shifting landscape too. For those caught between the battles or just lost in the vast swaths of ungoverned Japanese territory though, it was a dangerous time to be in. The period was noteworthy for its brutality and general disregard for human life, and gave way to some of the most fearsome samurai warriors in Japanese history. There are a few documentaries on this time period of Japan, and they were all very informative and super interesting. It's pretty neat to look back now and see what was going on, but back then, having to live through it, that would have been horrible. It really was like a massive game of Risk that everyone was playing. And even if you were just a farmer trying to survive, it didn't matter. You were now caught up in this massive game of Risk, and your life was constantly on the line. Number 2 on this list is the Roman Empire. Okay, wait, I thought the Roman Empire was supposed to be one of the greatest empires ever. Well, it was. And if you were one of the leaders or a member of the elite class during this time, then you were laughing. But for some, it wasn't as nice. Specifically, the miners. The Roman Empire had a lot of slaves, mostly people that were taken from conquered territories and forced to work for the Romans. The worst possible place that you could be sent though was the mines. If you were a slave and you got sent to the Roman Empire mines, then it's about to get horribly bad. The conditions were awful down there. Mining was relatively new back then, and there wasn't really any advanced technology to help these people. Not that they would have received any help anyways though. The Romans were brutal to these people, and specifically handpicked people they didn't like to be sent down there. Disease was widespread because people were literally worked to death and never cleaned. They were given very little food, and if they weren't producing quick enough, then they would just be killed. And oftentimes these killings were of amusement to the guards as well, and they would mutilate you or throw you in a pit with a hungry wild animal. There were literally no redeeming qualities to the mines at all, and you probably wished for death if you got sent there. And finally, number 1 on this list is the year 536. Kind of a specific year here, folks, but from what I've heard, it was literally the worst. List verse says, when us laymen talk about the worst times in history, we're thinking of stuff like violence and proximity to cannibalism. We don't have any scientific parameters to measure how bad a time is for the people living in it, though we can make educated guesses. When it comes to actual scientists though, they don't bother with guesses or estimates, and have calculated the exact year it was the worst time to be alive in history, the year 536. Apart from the falling empires the world over and general political chaos, the year 536 also marked one of the worst global famines in human history. The famine was due to ash in the air blocking the sunlight, which isn't surprising as there were also quite a few humongous volcanic eruptions around that time for good measure. The foggy eclipse of the sun, as it was described then, was visible everywhere in the world, giving the whole thing an even creepier vibe. Combine that with brutal conflicts in many places around the world, and you know why the researchers chose the year 536 to be the absolute worst one in history. So basically, year 536 was just hell on earth. Everyone was either dying or fighting, or they were dying of not having any food at all. It's kind of crazy to think that only a few thousand years ago, this could have been us. Nowadays, farming is so advanced that most of us are in a pretty good place when it comes to food, but back then, if the river dried up or the sun didn't come out, that was it, guys. We just aren't going to be eating anymore. Just be thankful that the year is 2022 right now and not 536.
Kicking off at number 5, the witch's well. And whilst Europe as a whole has had a long tragic line of witch hunting throughout its long and bloody history, there is perhaps one location in Scotland that exemplifies that period more so than any other. Edinburgh Castle is a hive of activity, a beautiful structure that speaks of the city's ancient roots and its mystical origin, but as you walk around its high walls, you'd may be amiss to know that you're walking amongst the same ground of a brutal and horrifying massacre that stretched out over a century. Now, the Witch's Well, a cast iron fountain and plaque, honours the Scottish people who were burned at the stake at Edinburgh Castle between the 15th and 18th centuries. But it was the 16th century, and one king in particular, where the Witch's Well saw more bloodshed than anywhere else in Scotland. King James VI and I of Scotland and England respectively was certainly an intriguing figure throughout British history, but it was his unique brand of zealotry that led to the deaths of thousands of innocent women, each of them without a trial. King James believed that witchcraft was a form of Satanism, and that anyone who possessed the abilities that he perceived as mystical, be it herbology or even dancing, were in fact possessed by the devil himself. You see, King James was obsessed with the notion of witchcraft and would write countless literature about demonology, but all of this culminated in a period that ran throughout the 17th and 18th centuries at Edinburgh Castle. As a result, more than 4,000 alleged witches, nearly all of them female, were mercilessly put to death. In fact, so many of them were brutally murdered that the usual act of burning at the stake was replaced with routine hanging, the last of which took place in 1728. During this horrifying satanic panic, pretty much anyone and everyone could be unrightfully accused of practicing black magic. Many of those that were killed were keen herbalists demonstrating an ancient practice of medicine. Some of them were mentally ill and wrongfully deemed possessed, and even rarer, some of those killed were merely on the wrong end of someone else's malice, murdered over a squabble. It was a brutal time not only in Scottish history but the entirety of the British Isles, and the Witch's Well at Edinburgh Castle stands as a monument, a mortal reminder of those vile deeds. Swinging in at number 4, Skara Brae. And to be honest, I just love saying that name, Skara Brae. Skara Brae. Feels good under the tongue, right? Well, the thing is, for this entry on our list, we're going to be going back pretty far. In fact, further back than any other entry in Scottish history, and perhaps even further back than any other historical instance imaginable, really. Skara Brae is a location far, far older than Stonehenge and far older than even the Great Pyramids of Giza themselves, and it's tucked on a series of little islands just off the coast of Scotland, Orkney. Europe's most complete ancient Neolithic village, which, whilst being completely and utterly amazing in itself, may also be evidence of a far more terrifying event than any of us could have ever imagined. You see, there is a reason why Skara Brae is often called the Scottish Pompeii, because although it is remarkably preserved in a similar fashion to the ancient Italian volcanic city, it also seems to be evidence of a similar sort of disaster. Back in the winter of 1850, a severe storm battered Scotland, causing immense damage to the populace and over 200 deaths. In the Bay of Scale within the Orkney Isles, the storm stripped away a mass of earth, and when the storm cleared, the nearby villagers were astounded to find the outline of an ancient village. Although the local Laird William Watt of Scale conducted an excavation, it wasn't until 1927 that the actual location was fully excavated, which would take another 60 or so years to be completed. Originally, it was thought that the site was from around 500 BC, but when radiocarbon samples were fully tested, it was revealed that Skara Brae was built by at least 3180 BC. Now, as there is evidence of the inhabitants of Skara Brae being taken by surprise and fleeing the site in a hurry, such as remains of choice meats being cooked on the fire left behind, and evidence of one woman fleeing in such haste that her necklace broke as she tried to squeeze through the narrow doorway of her home. Now, while Skara Brae is still very much a mystery, the leading theory is that the disaster in question was another equally terrifying storm, the same kind that unearthed it in 1850. If that's the case, I think we should be on the lookout for a storm.
Number 3, the Black Hag. Our next witch probably has the most impressive title out of any of them, the Black Hag. That is such a cool name for a witch to have. She resides in a church called, oh god. Let me try this. The Monaster Nagal. Oh. What, you want to throw that on screen for me? Monaster how am I supposed to say that? This is the witch's curse. I don't even know about any witchy stuff she does. She tries to get you to say this evil word and then it curses your family. I'm getting a note over here. It says that it's also called the Abbey of the Black Hag. Well, that's what we're going with. We're not calling it that other thing. I'm not doing that. The Black Abbey of the Hag, which as far as I know is the only name this church has ever gone by, was built in 1298. Wow, it's an old church. And was one of the few well-known medieval convents in old Ireland. The remains of the abbey still stand today in a secluded valley, making an already mysterious and supernatural place just that much more atmospheric. The place is called the Abbey of the Black Hag, for God's sakes. You don't name a place that unless it's pretty haunted. Sounds like it's straight out of Dishonored. And while I've got you here, Dishonored 3, when? When's that happening? Now, it's believed that the last abbess, which is a horrible word, in charge of the abbey practiced witchcraft, and in the scary way. She brought death, misfortune to the surrounding areas. Pope Martin V condemned the abbey. He was not down for witches at all. Catholic Church don't play with witches. The accused witch left to live out in the damp, deserted abbey by herself, which she probably loved because that sounds scary. Over time, her skin blackened, her hair furled, and her soul twisted, leading to the place being named the Abbey of the Black Hag. And if you can believe this, there's actually more to this story. The Count and Countess of Desmond once called the abbey home when attempting to flee their attackers, where the Countess was fatally struck by an arrow and buried by her husband, but it would not be the end of the Countess. Sightings of a ghostly figure around the ruins of the abbey were common, eventually leading to someone digging up worn out finger bones. And it's said now that a woman's panicked shrieking can be heard in the early hours around the abbey. Number 2, the Blair Witch. Perhaps one of the most pervasive witches in pop culture after the Wicked Witch of the West, the Scourge of Maryland, the Blair Witch. Perhaps you saw the very successful 1999 documentary regarding her legend, or maybe you saw one of the 2 middling sequels. According to legends, she haunts the Black Hills Forest near the town of Burkittsville, Maryland. The local folklore states that in the 18th century, a woman named Ellie Kedward was accused of practicing witchcraft. She was chased and exiled out of the township of Blair and condemned to live in the woods, hence the Blair Witch. It's believed that she died out in the surrounding forests in the harsh winter of 1785, but it's also said that she placed a curse on the town moments before her death, vowing to seek revenge on the townspeople and their descendants for generations. And not to split hairs here, but that does actually kind of sound like she was a witch. I'm not saying it was justified in exiling a woman out of her town. just that placing a hex on a town definitely sounds like witchcraft, and I can understand where they were coming from. I'm just trying to understand the scenario, okay? I'm divorced from it. I'm not part of it. I'm just trying to understand it. From here, the legends of Kedward grew into the larger-than-life figure, the Blair Witch. Various disturbing events were attributed to the Blair Witch. Mysterious disappearances, people being lured away into the woods, supernatural phenomena, camera crews disappearing in forests, reports of finding strange hex bags in the surrounding woods filled with strange runes and symbols and remnants of people, hair, teeth, for her to perform wicked rituals. Now, it goes without saying, unless you firmly believed the marketing campaign of the 1999 film, the Blair Witch Project is obviously a movie. While they say it's based on the real story of Ellie Kedward, there is no record of a Blair Township ever having existed. Almost certainly, the Blair Witch's story is inspired in large swaths by the Bell Witch, who we talked about earlier. Although in a kind of unique case, back in the day when the Blair Witch did come out, its marketing was so effective, and in this sort of like pre-early internet area, there were several people who did think it was real. It was a cast of completely unknown actors by a team no one had ever heard of. And on some level, I don't know, maybe to get esoteric with it, what makes an urban legend real? Just us believing in it, right? Do you believe the other 4 stories I've told you more? They're no less fictional. My only source was the internet for all of those. So, I'm just saying, open mind. Number 1, La Bruja de Caxiche. And our final witch for today is going to be La Bruja de Caxiche, a well-known urban legend from Peru, specifically from the coastal town of Caxiche near the city of Ica. The legend revolves around a reputed witch who lived during the colonial era. According to legend, La Bruja de Caxiche was an enigmatic woman with exceptional powers and knowledge of witchcraft. She was believed to possess both healing abilities and the abilities to cast curses. She multi-spec'd. It was said that she used various herbs, potions, and rituals to perform her magic. Now, one of the most interesting aspects of this legend is this belief that La Bruja de Caxiche had a physical deformity, specifically a hunchback. And if there's one thing we love in an urban legend, it's a bit of a physical deformity. It makes it that much more believable and scary. Because someone conventionally unattractive is way scarier than not. Don't blame me, blame our Western views on beauty. I didn't write them, I just perpetuate them. Over time, the legend of La Bruja de Caxiche became intertwined with the history and culture of the town of Caxiche. Local residents and visitors began associating certain landmarks and natural phenomena with their presence. For example, there's a famous gnarled and twisted tree called the Witch's Tree that is said to have been her gathering place. Today, Caxiche has embraced the legend of La Bruja de Caxiche as part of its heritage. The town has a statue of the witch, and there are various festivals and events dedicated to her, and I guarantee you no party goes even half as hard as a party celebrating a local witch. Oh my god, imagine the cauldrons do. The legend has also become a popular tourist attraction, drawing visitors who are interested in the occult, folklore, and statues.
Number 5. The WOW signal. In a 1959 paper, Cornell University's physicists had speculated that any extraterrestrial civilization attempting to communicate with radio signals might use a frequency of 1420 megahertz, which is naturally emitted by hydrogen, the most common element in the universe. In 1973, after completing an extensive survey of extragalactic radio sources, Ohio State University assigned the Big Ear to the scientific search for extraterrestrial intelligence famously known as SETI. Giant dish. Think Jodie Foster in Contact. 1977, Jeremy Amon, a SETI volunteer astronomer, was analyzing by hand large amounts of data processed by an old IBM computer. He spots a series of signal intensities and frequencies that left him and his colleagues astonished. The WOW signal was the first radio signal detected from Earth. The signal came from the direction of the constellation Sagittarius. Amon discovered the anomaly a few days later while reviewing the recorded data. Impressed by the result, on the computer printout he circled 6EQUJ5 and wrote 3 letters beside it. WOW. Leading to the event's famous name. The signal lasted for the full 72-second window during which Big Ear was able to observe it, but has not been able to detect it since, despite several attempts by Amon and others. It remains, as 2020, the strongest candidate for an extraterrestrial radio transmission ever detected. To this day, nobody can explain the signal, even though many have tried, claiming it could have just come from us. I don't know. What do you think? Number 4. Harvard psilocybin experiments. Operation Midnight Climax, 1954, consisted of a series of CIA-run safe houses and what went on inside them in San Francisco, California, and New York City. In 1960, two psychologists, Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, ordered psilocybin from a Swiss company named Sandoz, with the intention to test if different administration modes lead to different experiences. They believed that psilocybin could be the solution for the emotional problems of the human brain. The first test group was 38 people of various backgrounds. 167 subjects in total participated in the study, willing or unwilling. In 1961, Leary decided to orient the study towards psilocybin mushrooms and the rehabilitation of prison inmates. The San Francisco safe houses were closed in 1965, and the New York City safe houses soon followed in 1966. Operation Midnight Climax and Project MK Ultra were considered to be so secretive that few people, even of the highest government positions, knew of their existence. Midnight Climax being a sub-project of MK Ultra's The Mind Control research program that began in the late 1950s by Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, who was a chemist of the CIA. Unlike Project Artichoke, Operation Midnight Climax gave Gottlieb permission to test drugs on unknowing citizens, which made way for the legacy of this operation. Hundreds of federal agents, field operatives, and scientists worked on these programs before they were shut down in the mid-1960s. Science or sinister?
Next up at number 3, the Massacre of Glencoe. And this one in particular has been immortalised in countless fictional works, paying homage to a terrifying and bloodthirsty event in Scottish history. But as is the case with many things, the truth of this historical instance is full of far more horror than in fiction. Now, the Jacobite uprising was a particularly complex and brutal time in the history of the British Isles, but the worst of it culminated in the Scottish Highlands. After losing the throne of England and Scotland to William III in March of 1689, after landing in Ireland in an attempt to regain the throne, James II and VII recruited a small force of Highlanders to support him in his campaign through Scotland. Now, it's important to note that many Scottish clans have remained loyal to King James, the most profound of which were the MacGregors, the Keppoch MacDonalds, and of course the Glencoe MacDonalds. And keep that name in mind. You see, the thing is, in August of 1691, the government had offered an indemnity to all Scottish chiefs, as long as they swore an oath of allegiance before New Year's Day, January the 1st, 1682. In total, the Secretary of State at the time, Lord Stair, offered a total of £12,000 British pounds for swearing their allegiance to King William, which, as you may imagine, was quite the allure for many other Jacobite-leaning chieftains. On top of that, letters of fire and sword were sent out authorising savage attacks on anyone that would not comply to the order, and interestingly enough, it worked. Pretty much all of the Scottish chiefs took the oath. However, Chief Alexander MacDonald of Glencoe wasn't so sure, and he had postponed his submission of the oath until December 31st, 1691. You see, at the time he was hosting 120 men of the Earl of Argyll, and he wouldn't be able to make it to the nearest magistrate at Fort William until January the 6th. Hearing that news, King William ordered swift punishment to the MacDonalds, and the next moment, over 100 of the Earl's soldiers, who had been quartered amicably at Glencoe for more than a week, suddenly turned and attacked the MacDonalds mercilessly. 33 men, 2 women and 2 children were slaughtered by their own guests, who had been fed and watered and entertained without a second thought. And now we can sort of understand the importance of hospitality, can't we? Hopefully. Coming in at number 2, the Black Dinner. And if that previous entry sounds like something straight out of Game of Thrones, then that's because George R.R. Martin was pretty damn inspired by British history, particularly the history of Scotland. And while this one instance in particular may well seem pretty damn familiar, but that also doesn't make it any less terrifying, because like I said, history is far more horrifying than fiction, because the Black Dinner actually happened. Let's take it back to the year of 1440, a tumultuous time in Scottish history during the reign of King James II, who was just 10 years old at the time. You see, Scotland was under the shaky yet tentative power sharing regent rulership of 2 men, Sir Alexander Livingston and Sir William Crichton. It was the second period of regency in a short space of time after King James I was also briefly under the same sort of stewardship. You see, one of those previous regent stewards was a man named Archibald Douglas, 4th Earl of Douglas, who was an all-around pretty decent guy, so much so that in this story you could consider him to be Ned Stark. You see, by the 15th century, the Douglases had become so powerful and damn honourable that some schemers such as Livingston and Crichton saw their family as a threat to the stability of the nation. In 1440, the grandson of Archibald, the 16-year-old William Douglas, 6th Earl of Douglas, was invited to Edinburgh Castle for a spectacular feast alongside his younger brother, David. The two of them were invited to dine beside the 10-year-old King James II, and on November 24th, 1440, the small Douglas entourage had arrived. According to legend, the banquet was held in the Great Hall of Edinburgh Castle, and the young king was completely enamoured by the charming and noble Douglases. At the end of the feast though, after the hall went silent, the head of a black bull was brought out on a platter and paraded in front of them. Under ancient Scottish custom, the head of a black bull was the symbol of death, and in rare customary moments, this formality presaged the death of the principal guests of a feast. As the legend goes, King James II was alleged to have pleaded for the lives of his new friends and for the Douglases to be spared, but it is said that his pleas fell on deaf ears, even as king. Both William Douglas and David Douglas were beheaded in front of the then 10-year-old king. And finally, coming in at number 1 spot, Sawney Bean. Because talking of dinner, we certainly can't make this list without featuring perhaps the most notoriously grim instance of folklore in Scottish history, the legend of Sawney Bean. Now also, whilst this entry is potentially the most gruesome in the whole of Scottish history, it's also important to note that not all of the legend of Sawney Bean can be historically verified, and the vast majority of it is resigned to the whisperings of folklore. It's just food for thought. Sorry, I'll stop talking about food now. You see, little is known about the early life of the notorious Sawney Bean, but it is said that he may have been born in East Lothian sometime in the late 16th century. When he reached adulthood, he became a ditch digger, but it seemed that the life of honest labour was not for him. He left home with a, and I quote, a vicious woman named Agnes Douglas, who apparently shared Sawney's inclination for ferocity after being accused of being a witch. On the way, they'd rob anyone that crossed their path, and this is where their first taste for a far more sinister crime began to establish itself. It is said that on the road, Sawney and Agnes cannibalized one of their victims. Eventually, the couple settled in a coastal cave, a place hidden just beneath Banay Head between Girvan and Ballantrae, where they lived undiscovered for over 25 years. As the legend goes, the cave that they made their home was 200 yards deep, and the entrance was completely blocked by water during high tide. And if that sounds like the perfect place to establish an incestuous tribe of cannibals, then that's because it was. You see, Bean and Agnes produced 8 sons, 6 daughters, 18 grandchildren, and 14 granddaughters, the majority of which were the produce of incest between their children. At the height of their terrifying reign, the Bean clan would carefully lay ambushes on the nearby road at night to rob and murder individuals or small groups. Their bodies, stripped and picked clean, would be brought back to the cave where they were eaten. Leftovers were pickled in barrels or dried like jerky. One night, however, after trying to ambush a newly married couple, the Bean clan met their match, and the young groom fought them with a pistol and sword in combat. Eventually, their secret cave was routed, and the Bean clan was captured and executed. Now, the actual details of which are down to wild speculation, but one thing is for certain: the cannibal clan of Sawney Bean was said to have murdered and eaten over 1,000 victims. Oh, and also one version of the legend states that the tribe were never actually captured, and the nearby townsfolk were too terrified to go into the cave, so they just blew it up with dynamite. And I don't know about you, but that sounds like a sequel to me.
Kicking us off in 5th place, we have the creatures of Utah Lake. Allegedly around 14 feet deep, the lake has been home to many a mysterious drowning or disappearance over the years, with numerous planes and boats rumored to be littering its depths. The creature of Utah's Bear Lake is the most well-known tale of the local unknown water cryptids. The local surrounding Native American tribes, Shoshone, Ute, and Bannock, were the first to speak about this creature. It was described as a giant serpent, or dragon-like beast, that would capture and carry away any and all that dare swim in the lake. Okay, I won't swim there. In the early 1860s, Mormon settlers began to see these creatures. S.M. Johnson claimed to have seen something akin to a downed carcass floating in the water. He described it as having cluster-like ears the size of teacups, and it could spurt geysers of water from its nose. So a weird-looking whale? I'm trying to picture it. You let me know in the comments if you can picture that. He believed that it must have been of enormous size because it didn't drift to the shore, so its legs must have been embedded in the muddy bottom of the lake. Most of the sightings of this creature describe it as a kind of dragon, or freakish, alligator-like beast. In the year 2000, James Chase noticed something strange swimming in the lake near Pelican Point, around 40 yards from where he was, so a little distance away. He claimed to have seen something that was a little larger than a barrel drum in width, surfaced to the top of the water like a whale, and then submerged again. James said it was shimmering silver in color with large yellow stripes running vertically along its midsection. Now, James was a Hawaiian transplant and had encountered many different forms of ocean life, but he said he had never seen anything like this. Next up, we have water babies. That was my nickname as a kid. Apparently there's something to fear, and are also known as water kelpies or merfolk. The local water babies originate from the Native American Ute telling and can be found all over the world and fall into the category of undine, which is a fairy water species. Hey, I love fairies. And mermaids. Apparently they can be very dangerous if you disregard or disrespect them, but doesn't that apply to most things? Oh, so you know when you're walking by the shore and you hear the distant crying of babies? Yep, this is what you hear. Now most people will only hear them, because if you see them, I hate to break it to you, but probably too late for you. Many a boater has come upon what looks like floating reeds or lakeweed, but in actuality, it's the hair of the water baby just floating at the surface, and just below it, this water baby hides, waiting for the unsuspecting fisherman to fall into its trap. Okay, good to know if I ever randomly decide to take up fishing. Probably not gonna happen, I've done it like once in my lifetime. In fourth place, we have modern mummification. Yes, I'll back it up with some context first. I'm not evil. This is one of two scary religions I'll be discussing today. And while they're not necessarily on the traumatizing level of scary, it definitely falls under unsettling for, well, me at least. Back in 1975, Claude Corky Noel claimed to have had an encounter with highly intelligent beings he called Summa individuals, who revealed to him the true nature of the universe. Corky promptly changed his legal name to Summum Bonum Amon Ra, Corky Ra for short, and founded the Summum religion. Its name is a play on the Latin word summus, meaning highest, and the religion is based out of Salt Lake City. To an outside observer like myself, Summum resembles a blend of science fiction, with alien encounters, cloning, New Age mysticism, and a healthy blend of ancient religions. Summum draws many of its beliefs from Egyptian polytheism, with a particular emphasis on the sun god Ra, although it also relies on the teachings of Gnostic Christians, such as those found in the Gospel of Thomas. Practicing the religion relies heavily on meditation, aimed at the summum goal of spiritual psychokinesis. For those who are unaware, psychokinesis is the power to move objects with your brain, something I wouldn't mind doing when I do my grocery run next week. Groceries get heavy. A particular peculiarity of the church is that it practices modern mummification. Fun alliteration. It believes that mummification allows for a soul to smoothly depart from our world to the next. Additionally, it claims that the modern mummification process they use preserves the cells and enables them to be cloned in the future. Do you at least sign a consent form first? For some followers, reincarnation is a scientific as well as a spiritual concept. The Summum Pyramid was built between 1977 to 79 and serves as the church's main teaching space, meditation hall, and provider of modern mummification. Yeah, try saying that 5 times fast. Their pyramid, like their religion, is sealed except to the open mind. Whatever the heck that means. Here's something to chew on. The pyramid itself, which incorporates, the divine proportions into its measurements, is not zoned as a church, but take a wild guess. You're not gonna get this. A bonded winery. This is so the pyramid can produce what the Summum Church calls nectar publications, which are alcoholic drinks used during meditation services. Since the organization doesn't keep formal membership records, they base the number of people who have received the message of Summum on the number of wine bottles, or publications, they have distributed, which is somewhere around 250,000 to date. Okay, this is so wild to me, seeing as Utah is one of the driest states out there. To make ends meet, the Summum Church offers mummification services to non-Summum members for those who yearn for something more. It offers the service to both humans and pets alike. Prices range from $67,000 for a person to as low as $4,000 for a pet under 15 pounds. All I can think about right now is like that one episode of Criminal Minds where the unsub mummified people while they were still alive, and I kinda hate my brain for it.
Number 3. Exercise Tiger. Exercise Tiger, or Operation Tiger, was a series of large-scale rehearsals for the D-Day invasion of Normandy 1944, in which the military's lack of communication resulted in friendly fire from an Allied convoy being destroyed by German submarines, resulting in the deaths of at least 750 Americans. Wow. Of the 2 ships assigned to protect the convoy, only one was present. The second ship that was supposed to be present had been in a collision, suffered damage, and had to be repaired in secrecy. Because Allies' naval headquarters were operating on different frequencies, the American forces did not know this, and the first practice assault took place and was marked by an incident involving friendly fire. They didn't know it was an exercise. Set for 7:30 a.m., it was to include live ammunition to acclimatize the troops to the sights, sounds, and smells of war. This followed an order made by General Dwight Eisenhower, who felt that the men must be hardened by exposure to real battle conditions. Several of the ships landing that morning were delayed until 8:30, an hour later, and some landing craft didn't even receive word of the change at all. Landing on the beach at their original scheduled time, the second wave came under fire, suffering an unknown number of casualties. Rumors circulated along the fleet that as many as 450 men were killed, and it remained in secrecy in classification memos for numerous years after. I've seen Saving Private Ryan, and I can only imagine what this site looked like. Number 2. The Manhattan Project. Nuclear fission by chemists in 1938 made the development of the atomic project a theoretical possibility. The Manhattan Project was a research and development exercise during World War II that produced the first nuclear weapons. It was led by the United States with the support of the United Kingdom and Canada. Nuclear physicist Robert Oppenheimer was the director of the Los Alamos laboratory that designed the actual explosives. The Army component's first headquarters were in Manhattan, hence the name, the place name, and the official code name. The project began in 1939 and employed more than 130,000 people and cost nearly $2 billion to fund. Research and production took place at more than 30 sites across the US, United Kingdom, and Canada. During 1939, physicists drafted the Einstein-Szilard letter, which warned of the potentials of this extremely powerful creation of a new type. They had it signed by Albert Einstein and delivered to President Roosevelt. In 1941, President Roosevelt approved the atomic program, and Roosevelt chose the Army to run the project rather than the Navy because the Army had more experience with large-budget scientific projects. Plutonium was then chemically separated from the uranium by scientists, and the Fat Man and Little Boy implosion weapons were created at the Los Alamos laboratory in New Mexico. The first nuclear device ever detonated was the Trinity test, conducted at New Mexico's Alamogordo Range 1945. Little Boy and Fat Man explosives were used a month later in the atomic droppings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the immediate post-war years, the Manhattan Project conducted weapons testings, development of new weapons, promoted and supported medical research into radiology, and it maintained control over American atomic weapons research until the formation of the United States Atomic Energy Commission in 1947. Classified stuff, people. These were very scary times. And coming in at number 1, the Philadelphia experiment. This one scares me, and I pray it really is a hoax because there's a lot of documents that relate to this subject around this time that don't really add up. The Philadelphia experiment was an alleged event witnessed by Carl Allen and the United States Navy shipyard in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in October 1943. Allen describes an experiment where the US Navy attempted to render itself invisible, cloaking the destroyer USS Eldridge, and the bizarre scientific events and results that followed. On Allen's account, the destroyer was successfully made invisible, but the ship inexplicably teleported to Norfolk, Virginia for several minutes and then reappeared back in the Philadelphia yard. The ship's crew is supposed to have suffered various side effects including insanity, intangibility, and being frozen in place. The story first surfaced in late 1955 when Allen sent a book full of handwritten letters referring to the experiment to a US Navy research organization. The US Navy maintains that no such experiment was ever conducted, that the details of the story contradict well-established facts about the USS Eldridge, and that the physics the experiments are claiming to be based on doesn't even exist. What do you think? I think this actually happened and the gruesome details of the side effects are just misinformation. I don't know. I get a weird feeling about this one. Too many science experiments at that time.
In 5th place, we have witch cakes to kick us off. Sadly, these aren't yummy Halloween cakes, a thought which makes me very hungry, but instead a bizarre form of counter magic, a supernatural dessert used to identify suspected evildoers. In cases of mysterious illness or possession, witch hunters would take a sample of the victim's urine, mix it with rye meal and ashes, and bake it into a cake. This stomach-turning concoction was then fed to a familiar or animal helper of the suspected witch in the hopes that the creature would fall under its spell and reveal the name of the guilty sorcerer. During the hysteria that preceded the Salem witch trials, Tituba famously helped prepare a witch cake to identify the person responsible for bewitching young Betty Paris and others. The brew failed to work, and Tituba's knowledge of spells and folk remedies was later used as evidence against her when she was accused of being a witch. Before I forget, another use for a witch cake came from burning the pastry in hopes that the scorching heat would transfer to the witch and force her to reveal herself. Whew. Anybody else starting to get warm? Oh great, just me. In 4th place, we have a scold's bridle, also known as a witch's bridle, a gossip's bridle, a brink's bridle, or simply brinks. This was an instrument of punishment as a form of public humiliation. This thing was an iron muzzle in an iron framework that enclosed the head. Some exceptions were masks that depicted suffering, but not pleasant either way. My brain just jumped to a similar modern device used for pleasure instead of pain, and no, I will not elaborate on that thought, but let's clarify. A bridle bit, or curb plate, around 5 centimeters by 2.5 centimeters in size, was slid into the mouth and pressed down on top of the tongue, often with a spike on the tongue as a compress. It functioned to silence the wearer from speaking entirely, and caused extreme pain and physiological trauma to scare and intimidate the wearer into submission. This prevented speaking and resulted in many unpleasant side effects for the wearer, including excessive salivation and fatigue in the mouth. Seeing as I've always been a chatty Cathy, I can totally see how I would have been sentenced to this, and my jaw hurts just thinking about it. The wearer was then led around the town by a leash, and for extra humiliation, a bell could also be attached to, draw in crowds. First recorded in Scotland in 1567, the brinks were also used in England and its colonies. The Kirk Sessions and barony courts in Scotland inflicted the contraption mostly on female transgressors, and women considered to be rude, nags, common scolds, drunken, but mostly witches. It was also used as corporal punishment for other offenses, notably on female workhouse inmates. The person to be punished was placed in a public place for additional humiliation and sometimes beaten. Just sometimes, not every time apparently. Knowing what I know about history and cover-ups, I'm going to lean towards probably most of the time. The Lanarkburg records record a typical example of the punishment being used. When wearing the device, it was, impossible for the person to either eat or speak. Other pranks included an adjustable gag with a sharp edge, causing any movement of the mouth to result in laceration of the tongue. In Scotland, pranks could also be permanently displayed in public by attaching them, for example, to the town cross, tron, or toll booth. Then the ritual humiliation would take place, with the miscreant on public display. Displaying the pranks in public was intended to remind the populace of the consequences of any rash action or slander. Whether the person was paraded or simply taken to the point of punishment, the process of humiliation and expected repentance was the same. Time spent in the bridle was normally allocated by the Kirk Session in Scotland or by a local magistrate. In 3rd place, we have the legend of Old Main. As the legend goes, Virginia Loomis had her life ended in the late 1800s, and her body was discovered on the boulder used to make many of the bricks to construct the Cedar City building in 1898. It's said that some of the bricks contain her red bodily fluids, with one of them being occasionally on display at Southern Utah University. The supposed killer, Stephen Farr, later in life was hired as a janitor at the university, where revenge was served. On his first day of work, he was lighting the old coal furnace in Old Main's basement when something caused the furnace door to slam shut on his arm. Stephen burned to death, unable to wrench free, becoming the human torch that burned Old Main to the ground in 1948. It's said the ghost of Virginia was seen laughing in the flames, and Virginia was written on Stephen's skull. It's referenced at least as far back as a university newspaper article in 1986. There, it talks about the spooky happenings documented from the beginning, and a parapsychology expert who was brought in back in 1948 to solve 50 years of the building haunting people. I'm all for a girl power gal haunting like she rightfully deserves. In 2nd place, time to visit Skinwalker Ranch. Dang, it's been a minute since I've talked about cryptids, hasn't it? Well, here we go. Sherman Ranch, also known as Skinwalker Ranch, has been reported as a hub for paranormal activity ranging from UFO sightings to strange beasts with red eyes. The 500 acres of isolated land is located between Ballard and Vernal in Utah. The Sherman family acquired the ranch in the 1990s, but Native American myths of skinwalkers, witches with the ability to shapeshift into various animals, have haunted the region for centuries. Before the Sherman family inhabited the ranch, the spot was known as UFO Alley, and the Desert News reported in 1978 that nearby residents had spotted a dome-shaped UFO over the ranch that was surrounded by a glowing green light. Now, the supernatural activity didn't end when the Sherman family inhabited the ranch. The family reported doorways of light appearing in the mid-air, cattle that vanished, animals mutilated on the property, crop circle-like patterns in the surrounding fields, unidentified flying objects or orbs, and invisible objects emitting destructive magnetic fields. While investigating the disappearance of cattle, one man reportedly saw a large beast, like a wolf but larger, and cattle near the ranch. The man fired a tiny kaboom at the creature that hit its intended target, but the creature didn't slow down and appeared to escape unscathed. Well, if I ever find myself in Utah for some weird reason, I know where to visit. In first place, we have the Kingston Group Cult. This is sadly the one entry on today's list that's more horrifying from icky stuff instead of, spooky stuff. So if you want to jump over to the conclusion for ooky spooky creepy instead of yikes, feel free to do so now. I'll meet you there. For those who feel like they can endure listening to this, here goes. In 2022, the Kingston Group was on the receiving end of a lawsuit from former members that alleged years of unpaid labor, people selling, and icky non-consensual sexual stuff. The sex ex-members claim that it's largely through illegal marriage practices that the group is able to unlawfully make women and their offspring religious martyrs and traffic them for sexual and labor purposes. The lawsuit contains explicit details of how Kingston Group leaders allegedly arrange incestuous and sometimes way too young marriages between youngins and adult men with exalted status to produce hundreds of future followers. The suit alleges episodes of forced insemination aimed at forcing pregnancy and teaching elementary school attendees about plural marriage. 9 of the plaintiffs claim that the Kingston Group made them begin working during their elementary or preschool days, through their late teenage years, never receiving a paycheck. In her complaint, Amanda Ray Grant claimed she was assigned to work in her early teens at Advanced Copy, where wedding announcements and invitations were printed because, wedding pictures of incestuous or plural marriages can't be printed at Walmart. Another plaintiff, Jeremy Roberts, says he started working 4 hours a day, year-round, at a farm run by the Order when he was in the higher single digits of age, and by the time he was in the lower double digits, he was working 12-hour shifts at a mine that the Order ran. While the Kingston Group, founded in 1935, is not affiliated with the infamous FLDS, members practice a fundamentalist version of Mormonism that involves, polygamy. Members are primarily born into the organization, whose leader, Paul Eden Kingston, is known as the Man in the Watchtower. The lawsuit explains how the birth certificates of multiple plaintiffs failed to list their biological fathers, so those men could escape the legal consequences inherent to having multiple, often too young, wives. 2 of the plaintiffs share the same father, Jesse Orville Kingston. The suit alleges Kingston family members tried to preserve their lineage purity by marrying and procreating with other, Kingstons. Jesse Orville Kingston is not listed on either birth certificate, according to the lawsuit, which additionally accuses him of fathering more than 300 offspring with 14 wives. That's too many. No. I don't even want to have the idea of giving birth to one single being. Multiple? 300 divided by 14? I don't like that math. No. The Kingston Group argued that it's the parents' prerogative to file birth records for their children how they choose within the bounds of law, saying in a statement that it's especially true of the mother, who has the legal right to establish paternity or not to establish paternity at the time of filing. Okay. The statement added that the group has not issued any specific guidance for members pertaining to birth certificates, medical records, but encourages its members to follow the law. I'm calling bull. Anyone else?